Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that feels both familiar and impossibly distant. A world where fear became law, where neighbors turned against neighbors, and where the machinery of justice itself became an instrument of terror. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm grateful you're with me tonight. Before we begin this journey, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. The idea of this story reaching across the world, connecting us through history's darkest moments, always brings me comfort. And if these quiet explorations of the past help you find peace at night, please take a moment to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting for us in the darkness. Now, let your breathing deepen, let your muscles relax, and let's ease into tonight's tale together. Most of us think we know the story of the Salem Witch Trials. A few young girls accused some townspeople of witchcraft. Hysteria spread. Some unfortunate souls were executed before cooler heads prevailed. It's often told as a simple cautionary tale about superstition triumphing over reason, a relic of a more primitive time. But this sanitized version barely scratches the surface of what actually happened in Salem village and the surrounding areas between 1692 and 1693. The truth is far more disturbing, far more complex, and far more revealing about human nature than most people realize. What unfolded in Salem wasn't just a case of religious extremism or teenage girls seeking attention. It was a perfect storm of social tensions, economic disputes, personal vendettas, and psychological manipulation that created a killing machine fueled by fear and sanctioned by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. Tonight, we're going to explore why the Salem Witch Trials were worse than you thought. We'll examine the calculated cruelty behind the accusations, the systematic way evidence was manufactured, how the legal system itself became a weapon against the defenseless. We'll meet the real people behind the famous names and discover how their stories reveal a community that had completely lost its moral compass. But perhaps most disturbing of all, we'll see how the mechanisms that enabled Salem's horror aren't relics of a distant past. The same psychological and social forces that turn neighbors into executioners are still with us today, lurking beneath the surface of our supposedly civilized society, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The Salem Witch Trials began in the winter of 1692, when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, daughter and niece of Salem Village's minister Samuel Parris, began experiencing what their doctor diagnosed as supernatural affliction. The girls would scream, throw themselves on the ground, contort their bodies into impossible positions, and claim to see specters of witches tormenting them. But here's what most accounts leave out. These weren't random, spontaneous fits. The girls had been experimenting with folk magic, trying to divine their future husbands using an egg white dropped in a glass of water. It was a common practice among young women of the time, forbidden but widespread, when their fortune-telling sessions went wrong, possibly producing disturbing or unexpected results. The girls found themselves trapped between their Puritan community's strict prohibitions against such practices and their own fear of punishment. Rather than confess to their forbidden activities, they chose a different path. They began claiming they were victims of witchcraft, transforming themselves from potential sinners into innocent sufferers deserving of sympathy and protection. It was a calculated decision that would ultimately cost 20 people their lives. The first 3 women accused were hardly random choices. Tituba was an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in the Paris household and had likely taught the girls some of the folk magic they'd been practicing. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who had been asking for charity from Salem families, making her an easy target for a community that viewed poverty as a sign of moral failing. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him and had been involved in a bitter legal dispute over her late husband's estate. Notice the pattern here. The accusers didn't point fingers at respected community members or people with real power. They chose society's most vulnerable, a slave, a beggar, a social outcast. These women had no political connections, no economic influence, and no one willing to defend them. They were perfect scapegoats, perfect targets for a community looking for someone to blame for their anxieties and misfortunes. When these three women were arrested and interrogated, something truly sinister began to unfold. The legal system that was supposed to protect the innocent became a machine for manufacturing guilt. The interrogations weren't searches for truth. They were performances designed to extract confessions through psychological torture and manipulation. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who presided over the preliminary examinations, had already decided the accused were guilty before the questioning even began. Their job wasn't to determine innocence or guilt, but to force confessions and gather names of other supposed witches. The questioning followed a predictable, insidious pattern, leading questions designed to trap the accused. Threats of eternal damnation, promises of mercy for cooperation, and the constant presence of the afflicted girls who would convulse and scream whenever an accused person denied the charges against them. The most chilling aspect of these interrogations was how they were designed to make denial impossible. If you confessed to witchcraft, you lived but had to name other witches. If you maintained your innocence, you were obviously lying because the afflicted girl's suffering proved your guilt. The spectacle of their fits, their screams, their writhing bodies was treated as infallible evidence of your supernatural attack upon them. The only way to escape immediate execution was to become complicit in the system by accusing others. To save yourself, you had to destroy someone else. Tituba understood this horrible calculus better than anyone. When questioned, she didn't just confess to practicing witchcraft. She spun an elaborate tale of devil worship conspiracy involving multiple witches, mysterious men from Boston, and a book signed in blood. Her confession was everything the magistrates wanted to hear. Confirmation that a vast supernatural conspiracy was threatening Salem, justification for expanding the investigation, and a roadmap for finding more witches. Names, descriptions, details that could be used to identify and arrest others. But Tituba's confession was almost certainly fabricated. A desperate attempt to tell her interrogators what they wanted to hear in order to save her own life. She had learned, perhaps through her own cultural understanding or simply through survival instinct, that in this new reality, truth was whatever the authorities needed it to be, and survival meant becoming an active participant in the lie. The system that emerged from these early interrogations was diabolically efficient. The afflicted girls became the star witnesses, their theatrical fits and accusations treated as infallible evidence of supernatural attack. Anyone who questioned their credibility or suggested natural explanations for their behavior immediately became suspect themselves. The magistrates, convinced they were fighting a cosmic battle between good and evil, abandoned any pretense of fair legal procedure. What made this system particularly insidious was how it weaponized the community's existing tensions and grudges. Salem Village was already fractured by disputes over land. church leadership, and social status. Families that had been feuding for years suddenly had a legal mechanism to destroy their enemies. All you needed was to whisper the right words to the afflicted girls, and your rival could be arrested, interrogated, and potentially executed. The Putnam family, who were among the most vocal supporters of the witch trials, had been locked in bitter disputes with several families that would later find themselves accused of witchcraft. Thomas Putnam's 12-year-old daughter Anne was one of the primary accusers. And it's hard to believe her accusations weren't influenced by the adult grievances swirling around her household. Your breathing slows naturally now, becoming deeper and more peaceful, as you think about how fragile justice really is, how quickly the systems meant to protect us can become weapons against us. The people of Salem weren't primitive or uniquely evil. They were ordinary humans living in a time of stress and uncertainty. But they made choices to believe accusations without evidence, choices to abandon the principles that should have protected the innocent, choices to participate in a system they must have known, deep down, was fundamentally wrong. And maybe that's the most unsettling lesson, that we're all capable of such choices when fear takes hold, when we're convinced that the threat is real enough, when the cost of questioning seems higher than the cost of complying. The Salem Witch Trials teach us that civilization is thinner than we think, that the gap between justice and atrocity can be crossed in a matter of weeks when the right conditions align. Settling deeper into comfort now, grateful that you live in a time with more protections, more skepticism, more understanding of how fear can be manipulated, but also aware that the human tendencies that enabled Salem, the desire for simple explanations, the comfort of having someone to blame, the safety of joining the mob rather than standing alone, these haven't disappeared. They're still with us, still waiting, still ready to emerge when circumstances allow. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can rest knowing that these stories matter. That remembering Salem isn't just about honoring the victims. It's about staying vigilant, about recognizing the warning signs, about having the courage to question, to doubt, to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. The people of Salem didn't have the benefit of hindsight, but we do, and that makes all the difference. That gives us the power to see, to understand, to refuse to repeat their mistakes. So rest now. Let the weight of this history settle gently, not as a burden, but as a teacher, not as a nightmare, but as a lesson. The darkness of Salem can illuminate our present if we let it. As the spring of 1692 arrived in Salem village, the machinery of accusation began to accelerate with terrifying speed. What had started with 3 marginalized women quickly expanded into a web of suspicion that would eventually ensnare over 200 people. And the mechanism that made this expansion possible was spectral evidence, perhaps the most insidious legal innovation in American history. Spectral evidence meant that if someone claimed they saw the ghost or spirit of the accused tormenting them in a dream or vision, that testimony was considered valid proof in a court of law. Think about that for a moment. Dreams and visions, experiences that exist only in someone's mind, were being used to sentence real people to death. There was no way to disprove such evidence, no way to cross-examine a phantom, no way to establish an alibi against accusations of spiritual assault. The judges, led by William Stoughton, didn't just accept this supernatural testimony. They actively encouraged it. They created an environment where the most outlandish accusations were not only believed but rewarded. Children who pointed fingers at neighbors were praised for their bravery in fighting Satan. Adults who confessed to impossible crimes were spared execution while those who maintained their innocence faced the gallows. One of the most disturbing aspects was how the trials became grotesque theatre. The afflicted girls would writhe on the courtroom floor, screaming that the accused were pinching them or stabbing them with invisible pins. When the defendant moved their hand, the girls would mirror the motion, claiming they were being forced to copy the witch's movements. The courtroom would erupt in chaos, with spectators gasping and judges nodding gravely as if witnessing genuine supernatural warfare. But here's what makes this even more sinister. These performances were clearly coordinated. The girls had learnt that certain behaviors would guarantee the attention and protection of the most powerful men in the colony. They discovered they could destroy anyone they chose simply by pointing and screaming, and the adults who should have protected the innocent instead fed the monster they had created. The speed of the executions was breathtaking. Once accused, defendants had virtually no time to mount a proper defense. Bridget Bishop went from accusation to execution in just 2 months. Others had even less time. The court was operating like a conveyor belt of death, processing cases with ruthless efficiency that prioritized spectacle over justice. Each hanging validated the judge's belief that they were engaged in a righteous battle. Each confession confirmed their suspicions about the extent of the diabolic conspiracy. What's particularly chilling is how the accusations followed predictable patterns of social prejudice. Women who didn't conform to Puritan ideals of female submission were prime targets. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who had the audacity to mutter under her breath when refused charity. Sarah Osborne had committed the unforgivable sin of living with a man before marriage. These weren't random accusations. They were targeted character assassinations disguised as holy warfare. The economic motives become even clearer when you examine the property seizures. When someone was accused of witchcraft, their assets were immediately frozen. If they were executed, their property was forfeited to the state or distributed among their accusers. Suddenly, neighbors who had long-standing property disputes found a convenient way to eliminate their rivals. The witch trials became a mechanism for the largest forced wealth transfer in colonial Massachusetts history. Consider the case of George Jacobs Sr., a wealthy farmer who had accumulated significant property over his lifetime. His own granddaughter accused him of witchcraft, but only after he had refused to transfer his land to other family members. Within months, Jacobs was dead, and his property was being divided among those who had testified against him. This wasn't justice. This was legalized theft sanctified by religious hysteria. The authorities knew exactly what they were doing. Governor William Phipps had initially supported the trials, establishing the Special Court of Oyer and Terminer to handle the growing number of cases. But when his own wife was accused, he suddenly discovered serious problems with spectral evidence. The moment the accusations reached the upper echelons of colonial society, the entire system began to crumble. It wasn't divine intervention that ended the trials. It was raw political calculation. The aftermath reveals the most damning truth of all. When the hysteria finally ended, there was no reckoning, no systematic investigation into how so many innocent people had been murdered by their own neighbors. Instead, there was collective amnesia, a desperate attempt to pretend that Salem had been the victim of supernatural forces rather than human evil. The few apologies that came were pathetic exercises in blame shifting. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, eventually acknowledged his error, but only after it became politically safe to do so. He stood in church while his apology was read aloud, asking for forgiveness, but never truly examining how he had participated in such monstrous injustice. The accusers themselves largely escaped any consequences. And Putnam Jr., who had been responsible for many of the most dramatic accusations, offered a half-hearted apology years later, claiming she had been deluded by Satan. She never faced trial. She never made restitution. She simply moved on with her life while her victims remained dead. This pattern of deflection reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Salem. It wasn't just about superstition or religious extremism. It was about a community's willingness to sacrifice the innocent to protect the guilty. Your muscles continue to relax now, sinking deeper into the comfort of your bed. As you think about accountability, about how rare it is for people to truly acknowledge their participation in collective evil, the judges of Salem never admitted they had been wrong about spectral evidence. They simply stopped using it once it became inconvenient. The accusers never confessed to lying. They claimed demonic delusion. The community never confronted how they had turned on their neighbors. They simply tried to forget. This pattern would repeat throughout history. After every episode of mass hysteria, after every moral panic, after every witch hunt, literal or metaphorical, there's rarely true accountability. Instead, there's a quiet shuffling away from responsibility, a collective agreement to move forward without looking back too closely at what was done. And maybe that's understandable in a way, because to truly confront what happened in Salem would require the survivors to admit something unbearable, that they had participated in murder, that they had watched innocent people die and done nothing, that they had been cowards when courage was needed most. That kind of self-knowledge is almost impossible to bear. Settling deeper into peaceful rest now, grateful that you don't carry that burden, that you weren't tested in that particular fire, but also wondering, in the quiet honesty of this moment, what you would have done. Would you have been one of the few who spoke out, one of the many who stayed silent, or one of the accusers themselves, caught up in the performance, the attention, the power? It's easy to believe we would have been heroes. Harder to admit we might have been bystanders, or worse. The truth is, we never know until the moment arrives, until the mob is forming, and we have to choose whether to join it, watch it, or stand against it. The people of Salem probably thought they were good people too, right up until the moment they participated in evil. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let that uncertainty be a gift rather than a burden. Let it make you more compassionate toward those who failed their moral tests, more vigilant about your own choices, more aware that the capacity for both good and evil lives in every human heart, including yours. The darkness of Salem teaches us humility, teaches us to question our own certainties, teaches us that righteousness can be the most dangerous delusion of all. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't just the spectral evidence or the property seizures we've already explored. It was how the very foundations of justice itself were systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until what remained was nothing more than a grotesque theatre of predetermined guilt. Picture yourself in that courtroom in 1692, the air thick with tension and fear. You're accused of witchcraft, and you know with absolute certainty that you're innocent. But as you look around that room, you begin to realize something truly terrifying. This isn't actually a trial at all. It's an execution disguised as legal proceedings. The Salem Witch Trials represented one of the most complete perversions of justice in American history. Every single safeguard that should have protected the innocent was either ignored, twisted, or weaponized against them. And the truly horrifying part, the people running these trials knew exactly what they were doing. Let's start with the most fundamental corruption. The burden of proof. In any legitimate legal system, the accusers must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But in Salem, this was flipped entirely on its head. The accused had to prove their innocence. And here's the sick joke. How exactly do you prove you're not a witch? How do you prove you didn't send your spirit to torment someone in their dreams? How do you prove you didn't make a pact with the devil when no one was watching? How do you prove that the misfortunes that befell your neighbors weren't caused by your supernatural malice? The answer is brutally simple. You can't. And that was precisely the point. The court had created a perfect trap from which there was no escape. Deny the charges. Well, that's exactly what a witch would do. The devil is the father of lies, after all. So your denial is just more evidence of your guilt. More proof that Satan has his claws deep in your soul. Confess, then you're guilty as charged. And now you must name your accomplices or face execution. Provide an alibi. Your spirit could travel anywhere while your body stayed put. So your physical presence elsewhere means nothing. Call character witnesses. They're probably witches too. Protecting their own. Or they're lying to protect you, which makes them suspects as well. Sarah Good discovered this impossible situation firsthand when she was dragged before Magistrate John Hathorne. When he demanded she confess to tormenting children, she maintained her innocence with the desperation of someone who could see the noose tightening around her neck. His response was chilling in its circular logic. Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children, when Good continued to deny the charges, insisting she was innocent? Hathorne pressed further with a question designed to trap her. Who do you employ then to do it? Good's honest answer. I employ nobody. Was immediately twisted into evidence of guilt. After all, if she wasn't employing anyone else to torment the children, she must be doing it herself. The logic was airtight, impenetrably, and completely insane. But this wasn't incompetence or confusion. This was a deliberate strategy. The magistrates had abandoned any pretense of seeking truth. They had already decided these people were guilty, and the trials were simply a formality, a theatrical performance to justify the executions they had already planned. But the corruption went deeper than just shifting the burden of proof. The court had also completely abandoned any reasonable standards for admissible evidence. In legitimate legal proceedings, evidence must be reliable, verifiable, and relevant. It must be something that can be examined, questioned, and tested in Salem. The court accepted the most absurd and unprovable claims as absolute fact, treating them with the same weight as eyewitness testimony or physical evidence. Dreams were presented as evidence, not as interesting psychological phenomena or as possible symptoms of illness, but as literal supernatural attacks that had actually occurred. Visions were treated as eyewitness testimony. If someone claimed they had seen the accused spectre in a dream, that was considered just as valid as if they had seen the person commit a crime in broad daylight. Spectral sightings, claims that someone's spirit had been seen causing harm while their physical body was elsewhere, were not only accepted but became the primary form of evidence used to secure convictions. Think about how completely insane this really was, how divorced from any rational standard of justice. Imagine if modern courts operated this way. Your Honor, I had a dream that the defendant robbed a bank. I saw it clearly in my sleep. His spirit came to me and confessed everything. Well, that settles it then. Guilty as charged. Take him away. We would recognize such a system as absurd, as laughable, as a complete abandonment of justice. Yet this is precisely how Salem operated. But it gets even worse, even more deliberately cruel. The court didn't just passively accept this nonsense. They actively encouraged it. They created an environment where the more outlandish the accusation, the more seriously it was taken. When the afflicted girls would have their fits in the courtroom, writhing and screaming and claiming to see invisible spectres attacking them, the magistrates would play along with this theatre as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They would ask the accusers to describe what they were seeing in precise detail. They would demand the accused explain why their spectre was tormenting these poor innocent children. They would even order the accused to call back their spirits, as if this were all perfectly normal and reasonable, as if commanding invisible demons was something any person could do if they just tried hard enough. During Bridget Bishop's trial, a moment that would set the template for all the trials to follow. The afflicted claimed her spectre was pinching and choking them right there in the courtroom. Instead of questioning the reliability of such claims, instead of asking for any kind of proof beyond the girls' performances, Magistrate Hathorne asked Bishop directly, "Why do you seem to act witchcraft before us by the motion of your body, which seemeth to have influence upon the afflicted?" When Bishop naturally denied doing anything, denied even knowing what he was talking about. Hathorne responded with a question so absurd it would be funny if it weren't being used to justify murder. "Is it not your coat that hurts them?" They were seriously suggesting that a piece of clothing, an inanimate object, could commit assault through supernatural means. And this wasn't treated as a joke or a moment of temporary insanity. This was presented as legitimate evidence in a capital murder trial. This was considered reasonable discourse in a court of law. The accused weren't even allowed to defend themselves properly. When they tried to speak, to explain, to present their side of the story, they were shouted down by the afflicted girls' screaming fits. When they questioned the accusers, pointing out contradictions or impossibilities in their claims, they were told they were being disrespectful to the afflicted, that they were adding to these poor children's suffering by forcing them to relive their torment. When they pointed out the logical impossibilities in the charges against them, when they tried to use reason and evidence to demonstrate their innocence, they were accused of being argumentative and uncooperative, of showing the kind of prideful resistance that was itself evidence of diabolic influence. Martha Corey made the fatal mistake of expressing skepticism about the witch trials before she herself was accused, when she pointed out that the afflicted girls could simply be lying or mistaken, that there might be natural explanations for their behavior. This skepticism was later used as evidence of her guilt. After all, who but a witch would try to discredit witch trials? Who but someone in league with Satan would want to protect other witches by sowing doubt about the proceedings? The logic was perfect, circular, and absolutely inescapable. Your breathing becomes slower and more rhythmic now, deeper and more peaceful, as you think about how justice is supposed to work, how it's supposed to protect the innocent, not destroy them, how it's supposed to be based on evidence and reason, not fear and superstition. The people of Salem had all the tools they needed to see through this madness. They had legal traditions going back centuries. They had biblical principles about the importance of witnesses and evidence. They had their own common sense telling them something was deeply wrong. But they chose to ignore all of it. They chose to believe that the normal rules didn't apply when fighting Satan. They chose to think that the ends justified the means, that protecting the community from witches was more important than protecting the innocent from false accusations. And in making that choice, they destroyed the very thing they thought they were saving. They turned their community into a place of terror where anyone could be next, where innocence was no protection, where the only safety lay in being the accuser rather than the accused. Settling deeper into comfort now, grateful for the legal protections you have, for the presumption of innocence, for the right to face your accusers, for the requirement that evidence be real and verifiable, for the understanding that dreams and visions are not proof of anything except the workings of the human mind. These protections didn't appear out of nowhere. They were fought for, bled for, died for by people throughout history who recognized what happens when they're absent. Salem is one of those lessons written in blood, a permanent reminder of what we lose when we abandon the principles of justice in favor of expedience or fear. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can rest knowing that between you and that kind of madness stand centuries of hard-won rights and protections. They're not perfect, they're not invulnerable, but they're there. And as long as we remember why they matter, as long as we remember what happens when they're taken away, they give us a fighting chance at something better than Salem. The darkness of 1692 can't touch you here in your safe bed, but its lessons can and should, because the price of justice is eternal vigilance, and the cost of forgetting is always paid by the innocent. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't just the corrupted legal system or the fabricated evidence we've already explored. It was how the accusations themselves became a weapon of social warfare, wielded by those seeking to settle old scores and eliminate inconvenient neighbors. The finger-pointing wasn't random chaos erupting spontaneously from mass hysteria. It was strategic, calculated, and devastatingly effective at destroying lives while enriching the destroyers. Consider the case of Martha Corey, a woman whose only crime was expressing skepticism about the witch trials themselves. When the initial accusations began flying in early 1692, Corey made the fatal mistake of suggesting that the afflicted girls might be lying or mistaken. She questioned whether spectral evidence could really be trusted in a court of law, whether dreams and visions were solid enough ground on which to build capital cases. For this act of reasonable doubt, for daring to question the proceedings, she was immediately branded a witch herself. The message was crystal clear to everyone watching. Dissent would not be tolerated. Question the trials, and you become the next target. The accusers had stumbled upon the perfect system of social control, a mechanism that made opposition virtually impossible. Anyone who questioned the proceedings could instantly find themselves in chains. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of terror that made meaningful opposition almost suicidal. Speak out against the trials, and within days you'd find yourself accused, arrested, and facing the very injustice you had criticized. The community was effectively held hostage by its own fear. What made this system particularly cruel was how it exploited existing social tensions that had been simmering for years, sometimes for decades. Salem Village was already fractured by disputes over land boundaries, church leadership, and economic competition. Families had been feuding for generations over property lines and inheritance rights, over who got to graze their cattle where, over who owed whom money from business deals gone sour. The witch trials simply provided a convenient mechanism to weaponize these ancient grievances, to transform civil disputes into matters of life and death. Take the case of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother who was widely respected in the community for her piety and good works. She had spent decades caring for the sick, helping with difficult childbirths, and serving as a moral anchor for her neighbors. But the nurse family had been embroiled in a bitter land dispute with their neighbors, the Putnams, for over a generation. When young Anne Putnam Jr. began having fits and claimed to see Rebecca Nurse's spectre tormenting her, this wasn't supernatural intervention revealing hidden evil. This was the Putnam family using the witch trials as a weapon to destroy their enemies through legal means, to eliminate their rivals in a property dispute by having them executed for witchcraft. The pattern becomes even clearer when you map out the accusations geographically, when you look at where the accusers lived versus where the accused lived. The majority of the accused lived on the eastern side of Salem Village, while most of the accusers lived on the western side. This wasn't coincidence or random distribution. The two areas had been locked in a political and economic struggle for control of the village for years. They disagreed about everything, about whether to separate from Salem town, about who should be the minister, about how taxes should be collected and spent. The witch trials became the ultimate expression of this conflict, with one faction literally trying to eliminate the other through judicial murder. But the social weaponization of witchcraft accusations went beyond mere property disputes and political rivalries. The trials also served as a brutal form of patriarchal control, particularly targeting women who didn't conform to expected social roles. Many of the accused were widows who had inherited property, women who ran businesses, or those who had somehow challenged male authority. In a society where women were expected to be silent and submissive, any display of independence could be reframed as evidence of diabolic influence. Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in the Salem Witch Trials, was a perfect example of this dynamic. She operated a tavern, a business that put her in a position of authority over men who came to drink there. She wore colorful clothing instead of the drab, modest attire expected of Puritan women. She had been married 3 times, which raised eyebrows in a community that valued lifelong monogamous marriage. She was exactly the kind of woman who threatened the rigid social order that the Puritan community was trying to maintain. Her execution sent a clear message to other women about the consequences of stepping out of line. The accusers also discovered they could use the trials to eliminate economic competition, to get rid of business rivals who were a bit too successful, a bit too popular with customers. Martha Carrier was accused, partly because her family's success in farming had made neighbors jealous and resentful. Her crops were better, her livestock was healthier, her children were thriving, and in a community looking for someone to blame for their own difficulties, success itself could become suspicious. If your neighbor was prospering while you struggled, well, perhaps they had supernatural assistance. John Proctor was targeted after he criticized the trials publicly and threatened the economic interests of those profiting from the confiscated property of the accused. He was a successful farmer with a tavern business, and he wasn't shy about expressing his contempt for the proceedings. He called the afflicted girls liars. He suggested the magistrates were either fools or knaves, and for his outspokenness, for his refusal to play along with the madness, he paid with his life. The witch trials had become a grotesque form of hostile takeover, allowing people to destroy their rivals while claiming divine justification. Perhaps most disturbing was how the trials created what we might call an economy of accusation, a system where multiple parties had financial incentives to keep the trials going. The court officials who collected fees for each case, the jailers who were paid for keeping prisoners, the sheriffs who seized property and took their cut, even the ministers who provided spiritual guidance to the accused, who were paid for their counseling services. All of them had financial incentives to see the trials continue, to see more people accused, more property confiscated, more fees generated. The system had created its own marketplace of human misery, and business was booming. The psychological manipulation was equally sophisticated and equally devastating. The afflicted girls had learned they could command attention, sympathy, and power through their performances. In a society where young women had virtually no agency, where their voices didn't matter, where their opinions weren't sought, the trials offered them an intoxicating taste of influence. They could bring down respected adults with a word. They could disrupt court proceedings with their fits. They could hold entire communities enthralled with their dramatic accusation. With this power came at a terrible cost, a cost that many of them would pay for the rest of their lives. The girls were trapped in their own web of lies, forced to maintain increasingly elaborate performances to avoid being exposed as frauds. Each new accusation had to be more dramatic than the last. Each fit had to be more convincing. They were like actors in a play who could never leave the stage. Never drop character. Never admit that it was all performance. Some of them later expressed regret for their role in the trials, but by then it was too late. 20 people were dead and countless others had been destroyed. The trials also revealed how quickly a community could turn on itself when fear overrode reason and compassion. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades suddenly became mortal enemies, viewing each other with suspicion and hatred. Children were encouraged to testify against their own parents, to report suspicious behavior, to describe strange dreams in which their mother or father appeared as a witch. Husbands accused wives, wives accused husbands. The social fabric of Salem was completely shredded by suspicion and paranoia, torn apart by the very mechanism that was supposedly protecting it. What's particularly chilling is how normal people became complicit in this system of destruction. It wasn't just a few evil individuals orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. Ordinary citizens served on juries that convicted the innocent, knowing in their hearts that the evidence was thin, but voting guilty anyway. Neighbors provided testimony that sent people to their death, embellishing stories, adding details, saying what they thought the court wanted to hear. Community members attended the executions as public entertainment, bringing their children to watch, treating it like a festival or a show. Your muscles relax even deeper now, sinking into the safety of your bed as you think about complicity, about how easy it is to go along with something terrible when everyone else is doing it too. When the authorities say it's necessary, when the alternative is standing alone against the crowd, the people of Salem weren't monsters. They were humans, flawed, frightened humans who made terrible choices, but they were responsible for those choices nonetheless, settling into peaceful rest now, grateful that you live in a time with more protections, more skepticism, more understanding of how fear can be manipulated and weaponized, but also aware in the quiet honesty of this moment that those same human tendencies still exist. The desire to blame someone for our problems, the comfort of having a scapegoat, the safety of joining the mob rather than standing against it. These haven't disappeared. They're just waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the story of Salem remind you to question, to doubt, to ask for evidence, to stand up for the accused even when it's unpopular, to remember that the innocent need defending precisely because they're innocent, precisely because they have no way to prove their innocence against impossible accusations. The real horror of Salem wasn't the belief in witches. It was the willingness to kill people based on that belief without requiring proof. That's the lesson that echoes across centuries. That's the warning we must never forget. The speed with which the Salem Witch Trials escalated from a handful of accusations to a full-blown crisis consuming the entire region was breathtaking and terrifying. Within just a few months, what had begun with 3 marginalized women being accused had mushroomed into a nightmare that would eventually ensnare over 200 people. The machinery of persecution, once set in motion, seemed to develop its own momentum, its own terrible logic that made each new accusation easier than the last. Between February and September of 1692, the numbers tell a story of exponential horror. Over 200 people accused of witchcraft, dozens imprisoned in conditions so horrific that several died before they could even be tried, 20 people executed, their bodies left hanging as warnings to others. And behind each of these numbers was a real person, a real family torn apart, a real life destroyed by fear and lies and the systematic failure of every institution that should have protected them. But these stark numbers only hint at the true scope of the terror that gripped the community during those terrible months. The psychological torture inflicted on the accused began long before they reached the gallows, long before they even stood trial. Many spent months in chains, in overcrowded, unsanitary jails where disease was rampant and basic necessities like food and water were treated as luxuries that had to be paid for. The colonial prison system was designed more for holding debtors than for housing people awaiting trial, and it was completely overwhelmed by the flood of accused witches. Families were forced to pay for their loved ones' imprisonment, adding financial ruin to their emotional devastation. The jailer would present a bill for room and board, for the chains that bound the prisoner, for every scrap of food and every drop of water provided. Some families were bankrupted, simply trying to keep their accused relatives alive long enough to face trial. And if the accused was found guilty and executed, the family was still responsible for paying all those costs, adding insult to injury, forcing them to pay for the privilege of having their loved one imprisoned and killed. Some accused persons died in jail from the appalling conditions, becoming victims of the witch hunt just as surely as those who were executed. The elderly were particularly vulnerable. The cold, the damp, the poor nutrition, the stress, all of it took its toll on bodies that were already fragile. When they died in their cells, alone and forgotten, their families were denied even the dignity of a proper burial. They were buried in unmarked graves, their bodies disposed of like refuse, their names added to the list of victims that the community would later try desperately to forget. The executions themselves were public spectacles designed to reinforce the community's belief in the righteousness of their cause. The condemned were taken by cart to Gallows Hill, a rocky outcropping that overlooked Salem town. Crowds would gather to watch, bringing their children, treating it like a combination of religious ceremony and public entertainment. The atmosphere was often festive, with people bringing food and drink, chatting with neighbors, commenting on the proceedings as if they were watching a play rather than witnessing real human beings being killed. But even here, in their final moments, the accused often demonstrated more dignity and faith than their accusers and executioners. Many maintained their innocence to the end, refusing to confess to crimes they didn't commit, even though confession might have saved their lives. They would pray for their persecutors. They would forgive those who had testified against them. They would ask God to have mercy on the souls of those who were killing them. Their final words often revealed the profound injustice of their situation and the moral bankruptcy of the system that had condemned them. Rebecca Nurse, that 71-year-old grandmother whose only crime was being on the wrong side of a property dispute, was excommunicated from the church before her execution. The minister who had once praised her piety now declared her a servant of Satan. As she was led to the gallows, she maintained her innocence with a quiet dignity that moved even some of her accusers to tears. After she was hanged, her body was buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. Her family, at great personal risk, later snuck back in the darkness to recover her body and give her a proper burial on their own land. John Proctor, the farmer who had spoken out against the trials, went to his death knowing that his wife Elizabeth was pregnant and would soon give birth in jail. He had tried everything to save himself and his family. He had pointed out the logical inconsistencies in the accusation. He had challenged the validity of spectral evidence. He had even, in a moment of desperation, confessed to witchcraft, thinking it would save his life. But when he realized that confession meant he would have to name others, that he would have to become complicit in destroying more innocent people, he recanted. He chose death over dishonor. George Burroughs, the former minister who was accused of being the ringleader of all the witches, recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly while standing on the gallows. This was significant because it was believed that witches could not recite the prayer without making mistakes. The crowd was so moved by his perfect recitation, so shaken by the obvious innocence of this man they were about to kill, that they began to murmur and question whether a terrible mistake was being made. Cotton Mather, one of the most prominent ministers supporting the trials, quickly rode his horse into the crowd and reminded them that the devil could disguise himself as an angel of light, that Satan could give his servants the power to appear innocent even when they were guilty. The hanging proceeded. What makes the Salem Witch Trials worse than most people realize isn't just the number of lives lost or the brutality of the methods used. It's how the entire community became complicit in a system of legalized murder. It's how institutions that were supposed to protect the innocent became weapons against them. It's how quickly civilized people could be transformed into a mob baying for blood, convinced they were doing God's work, even as they destroyed their own neighbors. The trials revealed something deeply unsettling about human nature and the fragility of justice. They showed how fear could be weaponized, how authority could be corrupted, how quickly a community could lose its moral compass when caught in the grip of mass hysteria. They demonstrated that the mechanisms meant to protect us, the courts, the law, the church, could be turned against us with terrifying ease when the right combination of fear and ambition came together. Your breathing slows naturally now, becoming deeper and more peaceful as you think about protection, about how important it is to have systems in place that can resist the pressure of the moment, that can stand firm even when the crowd is screaming for blood. The people of Salem had laws, they had legal traditions, they had religious principles that should have guided them toward mercy and justice, but they abandoned all of it when fear took hold, settling deeper into comfort now. grateful for the protections that exist in your world, for the appellate courts that can review decisions, for the constitutional rights that can't be easily stripped away, for the journalists and watchdogs who shine light on injustice, for the understanding that the accused deserves a vigorous defense. Not because we think they're innocent, but because the system only works if everyone gets that defense. These protections were built on the graves of people like those who died at Salem. Think about what it must have been like to be innocent and to know with absolute certainty that you were going to die anyway. To know that no amount of truth-telling would save you, no amount of evidence would convince them, no demonstration of your good character would matter. To stand there with the rope around your neck, looking out at your neighbors, at people you had known for years, people you had helped and worked beside and prayed with, and to know they were going to watch you die and feel righteous about it. That's the true horror of Salem, not the supernatural elements that captivated everyone's imagination, not the folk magic or the devil worship or any of the theatrical elements of the accusations. The real horror was human. It was the complete breakdown of empathy, of reason, of basic human decency. It was the willingness of ordinary people to kill their neighbors based on nothing more than fear and lies and the say-so of teenage girls having fits. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the memory of those 20 victims rest gently in your mind. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, George Burroughs, Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs, John Willard, Giles Corey, who was pressed to death under stones rather than give the court the satisfaction of a trial, and all the others whose names deserve to be remembered. They died because their community failed them, because fear triumphed over justice, because good people stayed silent when courage was needed. Their deaths weren't meaningless if we learn from them, if we remember that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance. If we understand that justice isn't natural or automatic, but something we have to fight for every single day, if we recognize that the same forces that destroyed them, fear, prejudice, the comfort of having someone to blame, are still with us, still waiting for their moment. The darkness of Salem can't touch you here in your safe bed, but its lessons can and should, because the dead of Salem deserve to be more than just a cautionary tale. They deserve to be a call to action, a reminder that justice is never finished, never secure, never safe from those who would corrupt it for their own ends. As the summer of 1692 wore on and the body count continued to rise, something remarkable should have happened. Someone should have stepped forward to stop the madness. Some voice of reason should have pierced through the hysteria to point out the obvious fact that the emperor had no clothes, that the entire enterprise was built on lies and fear and impossible evidence. But that voice was slow in coming, and when it finally arrived, it came not from moral clarity but from political calculation. The trials continued unabated through the hot months of summer, with hangings occurring regularly at Gallows Hill. Each execution was supposed to bring the community closer to safety, closer to eliminating the diabolic threat in their midst. But instead, each hanging seemed to generate more accusations, more fears, more suspicions. The afflicted girls, emboldened by their success, began pointing fingers at increasingly prominent members of the community. The net was widening, drawing in people who had previously thought themselves safe. This is when things began to shift, not because anyone suddenly developed a conscience or started demanding evidence, but because the accusations finally reached people with enough power to fight back. When the wife of Governor William Phips was accused of witchcraft, suddenly the governor discovered that spectral evidence might not be as reliable as everyone had been saying. When prominent ministers and their family members came under suspicion, suddenly there was concern about due process and the need for more rigorous standards of proof. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. For months, the authorities had accepted the flimsiest evidence, the most absurd accusations, the most impossible claims. They had sent poor women, social outcasts, and powerless farmers to their deaths based on nothing more than teenage girls screaming in courtrooms. But the moment the accusations threatened the powerful, the wealthy, the well-connected, suddenly the standards changed. Suddenly, spectral evidence was questionable. Suddenly, confessions extracted under duress were unreliable. Suddenly, the afflicted girls might be mistaken or even lying. In October of 1692, Governor Phips dissolved the special court of Oyer and Termina that had been hearing the witch trial cases. He established new court procedures that specifically prohibited the use of spectral evidence. Almost immediately, the conviction stopped. Of the 52 people tried under the new standards, only 3 were found guilty, and Phips eventually pardoned them, along with everyone else still awaiting execution or imprisoned on witchcraft charges. The trials were effectively over. But what about the 20 people who had already been executed? What about the families that had been destroyed? The property that had been seized? The lives that had been ruined for them? There would be no pardon, no restoration, no meaningful accountability. The authorities who had orchestrated and carried out the trials simply walked away, quietly distancing themselves from what had happened, pretending they had been caught up in events beyond their control. The aftermath was almost as disturbing as the trials themselves. The community that had so eagerly participated in the witch hunt now desperately wanted to forget it had ever happened. There was a collective turning away, a shared decision to move forward without dwelling on the recent past. Some saw this as healing, as the community coming together to rebuild. But it was really avoidance, a refusal to confront what had been done and why it had been allowed to happen. A few individuals did eventually offer apologies, but these were notable more for their inadequacy than for their sincerity. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood in his church in 1697 and asked to be forgiven for his role in the trials, but he never explained how he'd been deceived. He never acknowledged that he had sent innocent people to their deaths. He simply asked for forgiveness and moved on. The congregation, eager to put the whole ugly episode behind them, granted it. Ann Putnam, Jr., one of the primary accusers, whose testimony had condemned multiple people to death, offered a public confession in 1706. 14 years after the trials, she claimed she had been deluded by Satan, that she had genuinely believed she was being tormented by witches, and that she now realized she had been wrong. She asked forgiveness from the families of those she had accused, but she never faced any legal consequences. She never made restitution. She never had to answer for the fact that her accusations, whether she believed them at the time or not, had resulted in innocent people being killed. Most of the other accusers never apologized at all. They simply stopped talking about it, allowing the events to fade into the past, as treating them like an embarrassing incident rather than a series of murders they had helped commit. The magistrates who had accepted spectral evidence, who had pressured defendants to confess, who had created the legal framework that made the trials possible. They too escaped without consequences. They continued in their positions. They were still respected members of the community. Some even went on to have distinguished careers. The community as a whole seemed to operate under an unspoken agreement that it was better to forget than to remember, better to move forward than to dwell on the past, better to let sleeping dogs lie than to dig too deeply into questions of responsibility and guilt. But this amnesia came at a cost. The families of the victims were left to carry their grief and anger alone, denied any real acknowledgement of the injustice that had been done to them. The social fabric of Salem remained torn for generations, with descendants of accusers and accused viewing each other with suspicion and resentment. And perhaps most troubling, the lack of accountability meant that the lessons of Salem were never truly learned by the people who had lived through it. Without a genuine reckoning, without a thorough examination of how and why the trials had happened, the community was left vulnerable to repeating the same mistakes in different forms. The mechanisms that had enabled Salem, the willingness to believe accusations without evidence, the tendency to scapegoat the vulnerable, the corruption of institutions meant to protect the innocent, all of these remained intact, waiting to be activated again under the right conditions. Your muscles continue to relax now, sinking deeper into the comfort of your bed as you think about accountability, about how rare it is in human history for communities to truly confront their collective wrongdoing, about how much easier it is to move on than to face uncomfortable truths. The people of Salem aren't unique in this. Throughout history, societies have committed terrible injustices and then tried to forget them, to minimize them, to explain them away as products of their time or understandable mistakes given the circumstances. But something important is lost when we allow this amnesia to set in. When we don't insist on accountability, on truth-telling, on genuine reckoning with what was done and why, we lose the opportunity to learn, to grow, to build protections against it happening again. We allow the perpetrators to escape responsibility and the victims to be forgotten. We send a message that some lives matter less than others, that some injustices are too inconvenient to address, that peace and moving forward are more important than justice and remembrance. Settling deeper into peaceful rest now, grateful that at least the historical record exists, that we know the names of the victims, that we can look back and see clearly what happened. Even if the people at the time couldn't or wouldn't, that we can learn the lessons they failed to learn, can build the protections they failed to build, can commit to the standards of evidence and justice they abandoned in their moment of crisis. Think about what justice should have looked like after Salem. Real trials for the false accusers, not to be vindictive, but to establish accountability. Compensation for the families whose loved ones were killed and whose property was seized. A systematic examination of how the courts had failed and what reforms were needed to prevent it from happening again. Public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Not vague apologies, but specific admissions of what had been done, to whom, and why it was wrong. None of that happened. The victims remained dead. The accusers lived on unbothered. The judges kept their positions. The community tried to forget. And the mechanisms that had enabled the horror remained largely in place, waiting for the next crisis to activate them. That's why Salem matters not just as history, but as warning, because it shows us what happens when we prioritize comfort over justice, when we choose forgetting over accountability, When we allow those who do wrong to escape consequences in the name of moving forward and healing, tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself feel anger about this if you need to. Anger is appropriate when contemplating injustice, especially injustice that was never properly addressed or corrected. But let that anger be purposeful, not destructive. Let it motivate you to demand better in your own time, to insist on accountability when wrong is done, to refuse to let injustice be swept under the rug for the sake of convenience or comfort. The dead of Salem can't speak for themselves anymore, but we can speak for them. We can remember their names. We can tell their stories. We can insist that what happened to them mattered, that it wasn't just an unfortunate historical incident, but a profound moral failure that should never be repeated. That's the least we owe them. That's the minimum price of learning from their suffering. Not to let their deaths be forgotten or minimized or explained away, but to hold them up as permanent reminders of what we're capable of when we abandon our principle, and what we must protect to ensure it doesn't happen again. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Salem Witch Trials, the element that makes them truly worse than most people realize, is how they reveal the mechanisms by which rational, civilized societies can descend into barbarism within a matter of months. Salem wasn't an isolated incident in some backward, ignorant community. It happened in Massachusetts Bay Colony, one of the most educated and literate societies in the world at that time. These were people who could read and write, who had legal traditions, who prided themselves on their moral and intellectual sophistication. The Puritan colonists of Massachusetts had created intricate systems of governance, established schools and colleges, developed complex theological frameworks. They weren't primitive or stupid or uniquely susceptible to superstition. They were, in many ways, the intellectual elite of their era. And yet they convinced themselves that the right response to some teenage girls having fits was to execute their neighbors based on dream testimony and spectral evidence. They convinced themselves that abandoning every principle of justice they claimed to value was acceptable, even necessary, in the fight against an invisible enemy. This is what makes Salem so terrifying and so relevant to every era, including our own. It demonstrates that intelligence, education, and sophisticated institutions are no protection against collective madness when fear takes hold. It shows that the descent from civilization to atrocity doesn't require ignorance or primitiveness. Just the right combination of anxiety, authority figures willing to exploit that anxiety, and a population willing to sacrifice principles for the illusion of safety. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Salem are disturbingly familiar to anyone who studies history or pays attention to current events. The identification of an internal threat that must be rooted out, the elevation of accusation to the level of proof, the inversion of the burden of proof so that the accused must prove innocence rather than the accuser proving guilt, the systematic dismantling of legal protections in the name of fighting an emergency, the silencing of dissent by making skepticism itself evidence of complicity with the enemy. These patterns appear again and again throughout history, in different contexts and with different targets, but with the same underlying dynamics. The witch hunts of early modern Europe, the French Revolution's reign of terror, the Stalinist purges, the McCarthy-era hearings, the dynamics are hauntingly similar. Accusations without evidence, confessions extracted through pressure, enemies lists that grow exponentially, the transformation of ordinary institutions into weapons of persecution. What Salem teaches us is that these dynamics can emerge anywhere, at any time, when certain conditions align, All it takes is a population under stress, experiencing genuine difficulties or fears. Add authority figures willing to identify a scapegoat and provide a simple explanation for complex problems. Mix in a mechanism for accusation that's easy to use and hard to defend against. Remove the normal safeguards that protect the innocent, and then watch as the system becomes self-perpetuating. As each accusation generates more accusations, as fear feeds on itself, as silence becomes complicity and opposition becomes suicide. The speed with which this happened in Salem should give us pause. The first accusations came in February of 1692. By June, people were being executed. By September, 20 were dead and hundreds were implicated. 9 months from normal society to killing machine. 9 months from rule of law to rule of fear. 9 months from community to catastrophe. If it could happen that quickly in Salem, how long would it take in your community, in your country, under the right circumstances, with the right triggers? How quickly could the world you know transform into something you wouldn't recognize? The people of Salem probably thought they were immune too. They probably believed their faith, their laws, their civilization made them safe from such dissent. They were wrong, and their wrongness cost 20 people their lives and hundreds more their freedom, their property, their sense of safety in their own community. The question isn't whether we're better than they were, more enlightened, more sophisticated. The question is whether we're vigilant enough to recognize the warning signs, brave enough to speak up when we see them, and committed enough to principles of justice to defend them, even when everyone else is abandoning them. Your breathing becomes even slower now, even deeper and more peaceful, as you think about vigilance, about the responsibility we all carry to watch for these patterns, to call them out when we see them emerging, to resist the comfortable seduction of joining the mob rather than standing against it. It's easy to believe we will be different, that we would be the ones who spoke up, who questioned, who refused to participate in injustice. But the historical record suggests otherwise. In every episode of mass hysteria, in every witch hunt, literal or metaphorical, the vast majority of people go along. Some because they genuinely believe in the threat. Some because they're afraid of becoming targets themselves. Some because they benefit from the persecution. Some simply because it's easier to follow the crowd than to stand alone. Only a tiny minority ever find the courage to resist, to speak truth to power, to defend the accused at risk to themselves. Settling deeper into comfort now, into the safety of your bed and your time and your distance from Salem's horror, but carrying with you the knowledge that this safety is contingent, that it depends on eternal vigilance, that it can be lost more quickly than most people imagine. The protections you have, the rights you take for granted, they weren't inevitable. They were built slowly, painfully, over centuries, often in direct response to horrors like Salem. And they can be dismantled just as quickly as they were built if we're not careful, if we're not paying attention, if we allow fear to override principle. Think about the institutions you trust to protect you, your courts, your government, your media, your community leaders. Are they strong enough to resist pressure when crisis comes? Are they committed enough to principles of justice to maintain them, even when maintaining them is unpopular or inconvenient? Do the people running them understand history well, enough to recognize the patterns when they start to emerge? The judges of Salem probably thought they were good men doing necessary work. The ministers who encouraged the trials probably believed they were protecting their flock. The community members who testified probably convinced themselves they were serving justice. They were all wrong. Their good intentions, their religious faith, their certainty that they were fighting evil. None of it changed the fact that they were participating in murder. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Salem, that good intentions are no protection against doing evil. That certainty is no guarantee of being right. That religious or ideological conviction can blind us to the humanity of those we're persecuting just as effectively as hatred or malice can. Sometimes the people who do the most harm are the ones who believe most strongly that they're doing good, because that belief insulates them from doubt, from questioning, from the internal voice that might otherwise stop them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the story of Salem make you humble about your own certainty, skeptical of simple explanations for complex problems, wary of any narrative that requires you to see your neighbors as enemies. Let it remind you that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, and the cost of failing that vigilance is always paid by the innocent, by the vulnerable, by those least able to defend themselves. The mechanisms that enabled Salem are still with us. The human tendency to seek scapegoats, the comfort of simple explanations, the fear of being left out when everyone else is joining the mob, the willingness to sacrifice principle for security, the terrible ease with which we can convince ourselves that this time is different, that these accusations are real, that these emergency measures are necessary. These haven't disappeared. They're not relics of a more primitive time. They're fundamental parts of human psychology, waiting to be activated when conditions are right. What stands between us and another Salem is not our intelligence or our enlightenment or our sophistication. It's our commitment to principles of justice, even when maintaining them is difficult. It's our willingness to defend the accused even when they're unpopular. It's our courage to question authority when authority is abusing its power. It's our refusal to participate in persecution, no matter how righteous the cause seems or how many others are joining in. These are the lessons written in blood on the graves of Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Bridget Bishop, and all the others who died at Salem. They died because their community failed them, because fear triumphed over justice, because good people stayed silent when courage was needed. Their deaths will be meaningless unless we learn from them, unless we commit to being better than the people who killed them, unless we promise to recognize the patterns and resist them when they emerge in our own time. The darkness of Salem reaches across 3 centuries to touch us still, not as a distant historical curiosity, but as a living warning, a permanent reminder of what we're capable of when we forget why justice matters, why evidence is necessary, why the burden of proof must always rest on the accuser, why the innocent deserve protection precisely because they're innocent. These aren't just legal technicalities. They're the foundations of civilization itself. And Salem shows us what happens when we tear those foundations down in the name of fighting evil. We become the evil we think we're fighting. And so we come to the end of our journey through the darkness of Salem. Though in truth, the journey never really ends. The lessons of 1692 echo forward through time, whispering warnings to anyone willing to listen, reminding us that the capacity for such horror lies dormant in every human heart, in every community, waiting only for the right conditions to awaken and destroy. The Salem Witch Trials claimed 20 lives through execution. Giles Corey, pressed to death under stones because he refused to enter a plea. Rebecca Nurse, the 71-year-old grandmother, hanged despite her lifetime of piety and good works. John Proctor, the farmer who spoke out against the madness and paid with his life. Bridget Bishop, the independent woman who refused to conform to expectations. Good, the homeless beggar whose poverty made her an easy target, and 15 others whose names deserve to be remembered, whose deaths deserve to be mourned, whose suffering should never be forgotten. But the trials claimed far more victims than those 20 souls who died on Gallows Hill. There were those who died in prison, succumbing to disease and despair in the horrific conditions of colonial jails. There were those whose lives were destroyed even though they survived, who lost everything they had, who were forever marked by the accusations against them. There were the children traumatized by watching their parents arrested and killed. There were the families torn apart by suspicion and accusation. There were the accusers themselves, especially the young girls, who had to live the rest of their lives knowing what they had done, what they had been part of, what their performances and their lives had cost. The full accounting of Salem's victims will never be complete because some costs can't be counted. Some wounds can't be quantified. How do you measure the loss of trust in a community? How do you calculate the cost of teaching an entire society that justice is optional? That evidence doesn't matter. That the innocent can be sacrificed for the convenience of the powerful. How do you account for all the ways that Salem poisoned the well of human relationships, making people suspicious of their neighbors, afraid to speak out, convinced that safety lies in silence rather than solidarity? In the years after the trials ended, Massachusetts Bay Colony attempted various forms of restitution. In 1711, the colonial legislature passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of those who had been accused. In 1757, the colony formally exonerated 5 more of the accused. But these gestures, well-meaning as they might have been, couldn't undo what had been done. The dead remained dead. The families remained broken. The community remained scarred. Some of the accusers, as we've noted, eventually offered apologies. Anne Putnam's public confession in 1706 was the most notable, but it came 14 years too late and was hedged with claims that she herself had been deceived by Satan. Most of the other accusers never apologized at all, taking their secrets to their graves. The magistrates and judges, with the exception of Samuel Sewall's carefully crafted public apology, also largely remained silent about their role in the proceedings. This pattern of incomplete accountability, of partial acknowledgement followed by collective amnesia, set a troubling precedent. It established that even the most serious miscarriages of justice could be swept under the rug, given enough time and enough willingness to move on. It taught that those in power could orchestrate judicial murder and escape meaningful consequences as long as they eventually expressed regret and the community was eager to forget. The legacy of Salem extends far beyond the specific events of 1692 and 93. The trials became a reference point, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what can go wrong when fear overwhelms reason. When Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in 1953, using Salem as an allegory for the McCarthy-era anti-communist hearings, he was drawing on this legacy, pointing out the similarities between the witch hunts of the 17th century and the Red Scares of the 20th. The patterns were the same: the accusations without evidence, the careers destroyed by mere suspicion, the climate of fear where anyone could be next. But Salem's lessons have been imperfectly learned. Throughout history, societies have continued to create their own witch hunts, their own mass hysterias, their own systems for persecuting the innocent while claiming to protect the community. The specific targets change, the specific accusations evolve, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent. The search for internal enemies, the acceptance of flimsy evidence, the rush to judgment, the abandonment of principles in the name of emergency, the silence of the majority in the face of injustice. Your breathing is so slow now, so deep and peaceful. As you begin to drift towards sleep, let yourself feel the weight of this history, not as a burden, but as a gift, because the dead of Salem gave us something precious through their suffering. They gave us a clear, undeniable example of what happens when we abandon justice. They gave us a warning written in blood. They gave us the knowledge that we are all capable of such evil, and therefore the understanding that we must be vigilant against it in ourselves as well as in others. As you settle deeper into rest, think about what you can do with this knowledge, how you can honor the victims of Salem, not just by remembering them, but by applying their lessons. When you see accusations without evidence, to speak up. When you see fear being used to justify the abandonment of principles, resist. When you see scapegoating and persecution of vulnerable groups, stand with the accused. When you see institutions corrupting themselves in the name of fighting some threat, demand accountability. These aren't grand gestures that will change the world overnight. They're small acts of courage that, multiplied across millions of people, create a culture where witch hunts become impossible because too many people refuse to participate. That's the real lesson of Salem, that these horrors don't happen because of a few evil people at the top. They happen because ordinary people in the middle and at the bottom go along, participate, or simply stay silent. And they can be prevented by those same ordinary people choosing differently. The protections you have, the rights you take for granted, they exist because of people throughout history who recognized the patterns and fought against them. People who said no when everyone else was saying yes. People who defended the unpopular, the accused, the vulnerable, even at cost to themselves. People who understood that justice isn't just about protecting the obviously innocent, but about maintaining principles even when, especially when it's difficult and unpopular to do so. Salem reminds us that civilization is fragile, that the distance between justice and atrocity can be crossed in months, that education and intelligence are no protection against collective madness, that the best institutions can be corrupted by fear and ambition. But it also reminds us that individual human beings have the power to resist, to question, to stand up, to say no. That power doesn't belong only to heroes or saints. It belongs to anyone who chooses to exercise it. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let the story of Salem settle into your memory, not as a nightmare, but as a teacher. Let it make you more skeptical of simple explanations and easy answers. Let it make you more protective of due process and the presumption of innocence. Let it make you more aware of how fear can be weaponized and how quickly ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. Let it make you more committed to speaking up, standing up, and refusing to participate in injustice, no matter how many others are joining in. The dead of Salem can rest now. Their story has been told once again. Their suffering has been acknowledged. Their lessons have been passed on to another generation. Rebecca, Nurse, and John Proctor, and Bridget Bishop, and all the others, they no longer need our tears. But they do need our commitment, our promise that we will not let their deaths be in vain. Our determination to build a world where such judicial murder becomes impossible because too many people understand the warning signs and refuse to participate. This is how we honor them, not with monuments or museums, though those have their place, but with vigilance, with courage, with an unwavering commitment to justice even when maintaining it is difficult, with the understanding that protecting the innocent especially the unpopular innocent, the vulnerable innocent, the innocent who have no power to protect themselves. This is the foundation of everything we call civilization. Good night, gentle soul. Sleep well in the knowledge that you carry these lessons with you now, that the darkness of Salem has taught you to recognize the warning signs, to question authority, to demand evidence, to defend the accused, to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. That you understand, in a way perhaps you didn't before, why justice matters, why truth matters, why principles matter, even when, especially when maintaining them is costly and unpopular. The Salem Witch Trials happened more than 300 years ago. The people who participated in them, accusers and accused alike, have long since turned to dust. But their story lives on because it must, because every generation needs to learn these lessons anew, because the capacity for such evil never disappears, only sleeps, waiting for conditions to awaken it. And the only defense is eternal vigilance, unwavering commitment to principle, and the courage of ordinary people who refuse to participate in injustice. Rest now. Dream peacefully. You are safe in your bed. In your time, surrounded by protections those who died at Salem never had, but carry their story with you into tomorrow. Let it make you more aware, more courageous, more committed to justice. Let it remind you that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the cost of failing that vigilance is always paid by the innocent. Sweet dreams, and may you wake with the determination to ensure that Salem's horror is never repeated, that its victims did not die in vain, that their suffering purchased wisdom we will never forget,